Sustainability, security, and hunger. In this episode of Bloomberg Green, we're focusing on food and how we can reduce its carbon footprint and get it to the people who need it. We'll explore the nearshoring of food production.
We're actually reinventing the entire supply chain. We are locating our farms close to the cities that we are actually serving.
The consequences of a lack of food for the poorest in society.
Right now, at this very moment, we do not have a food availability issue in the world. We are grappling with a food accessibility and a price-related issue.
And solutions for the planet, like vertical farming.
In order to mitigate risk and overcome those mega challenges, we need to diversify and we need to find alternative ways to farming.
From Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and this is Bloomberg Green. According to the United Nations, around a tenth of the world goes hungry. That's about 770 million people. And the number is rising, up about 6% last year. Africa is the worst hit continent, with more than 20% of the population facing hunger. The coronavirus pandemic and the war in Ukraine are exacerbating the issues and putting at risk a goal to solve the problem by the end of the decade. Another key risk for many poorer countries is extreme heat and what that does to crops. In last week's episode, we covered what extreme weather can do to the world and people. And in this episode, we're going to focus on food, farming, and solutions to solve the lack of availability and the carbon impact of producing nutritious meals. We're going to hear from the United Nations about some of the key issues to do with food and agriculture, and then explore some solutions for producing food near where people live, including vertical farming. But first, let's explore the impact of nearshoring food production.
President Joe Biden has signed a sweeping new tax and climate plan into law. The White House describes it as the largest ever single investment to address climate change.
Today offers further proof that the soul of America is vibrant, the future of America is bright, and the promise of America is real and just beginning.
This law will mean investment in new companies joining the fight against global warming. Some at the forefront are those involved in nearshoring food production. But what does that actually mean? Well, it's the opposite of globalization. Instead of taking advantage of cheaper labor and prices in other countries, nearshoring produces goods near where they're consumed. When it comes to dinner, food eaten in the U.S. travels between 1,500 and 2,500 miles from farm to plate. Is that a bad thing? Well, it is if we care about food security or emissions. The last 10 years saw more emissions than ever. More than a third came from food production. And food transportation is worse than we thought. A recent study found that it produces up to 7.5 times more greenhouse gases than previously estimated. Food miles are likely responsible for about 6% of the world's emissions. That's 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent every year. Emissions aren't equal. The 12.5% of the world's population in richer countries account for 46% of the emissions from food miles. More than a third of those emissions are generated by the international trade of fruit and vegetables, the highest for any group. The emissions from transporting fruit and veg is nearly double what's produced in growing them. Sticking to your 5 a day may be healthy for you, but if it comes from thousands of miles away, the impact on the planet can be huge. Take a head of lettuce. Grown in California and shipped across the country to Washington, D.C., that uses up about 36 times as much energy for transportation as it actually provides to the person who eats it. And the problem is only likely to get worse. Food production is helping to warm the planet, and that warmer planet is in turn affecting food production. Scorching weather and drought are decimating farm yields from Waterloo to Wichita, from Bangalore to Bordeaux. Food security also takes a hit as it becomes harder to produce and distribute spontaneously when supplies get disrupted, as they have been by the war in Ukraine or lockdowns in China. And climate disruptions are expected to get more varied and extreme. Reports even suggest that increased temperatures are changing the way food tastes and making some varieties of fish and vegetables harder to find. What if we could have a positive feedback loop instead? That's the goal with nearshoring. Goods are closer to the consumer, instantly cutting out most transport issues, emitting less and producing less waste. Locally grown food doesn't just travel less. It's also more likely to come from small family farms, which are run sustainably. They use less water and fewer harmful chemicals. So far this millennium, we've been encouraged to become herbivores. Well, perhaps it's time the focus shifted to making us locavores, people who eat food produced locally within 100 miles of our homes.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Green. I'm Kaylee Lines from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. After an era of abundance, fears abound that the world is entering into a fresh era of scarcity. Everything from climate change to pandemic disruptions to supply chains to war in Ukraine and deglobalization have impacted food security globally, especially in the world's developing countries. Now let's bring in Beth Bechtel, Deputy Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Beth, let's first just talk about the issues facing our global food supply and where climate ranks in that. How great a threat is it?
Yeah, so you are right on message in the fact that we are very much dealing today with a climate crisis that agriculture and food production is right at the center of. And this comes, as we all know, setting right on top of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we also have the war in Ukraine, which is disrupting markets, creating other challenges for farmers all over the world in terms of supply availability of both commodities and fertilizers and other important inputs. So when we think about the importance of needing to address climate-driven challenges and thinking about the future of how agriculture can become more sustainable, this is the moment, I think, before us to really make sure we commit to that.
Well, as you say, this is a problem all around the world, but what regions specifically are at the greatest risk?
Yeah, so when we really focus on climate, I mean, I think we have to be honest that really it's every part of the world that is seeing climate-driven impacts. We see those in the United States, we see them in Europe, whether it's increased temperatures, new floods that are emerging, continued droughts, rivers are drying up. But when we look at the places on this planet where people are food insecure, they're hungry, they're being driven to really high rates of starvation and even malnutrition, when we really think about those places and also have conflicts that have emerged, we really do need to focus our attention on the continent of Africa, on the global south, Latin America, Central America, the dry corridor, as we call it, and other parts of Asia as well.
Okay, so if the climate crisis is here in every part of the world, we need some kind of call to action if we're going to solve that problem or at least mitigate it, right? So what is tangible that can be done to protect the global food supply or at least adapt the way we think about food, the way we eat, what we're eating in order to be able to deal with that changing climate?
Yeah, so this is where for agriculture especially, I think this is the moment where all of us need to view agriculture as part of the solution as opposed to being a part of the problem. And this is where a real commitment to sustainable agricultural production, which means doing more, feeding more people, but doing it with fewer resources, fewer inputs, and with less of an impact on the planet. So doing more with less. And this is where I think in this very moment, the opportunity for science, for innovation, for digital services and digital tools to really have an impact to bring that kind of incremental productivity changes to all of agriculture is most important.
And finally, can we just talk about affordability? Because as we've seen borne out in so many different sectors of the economy in the last year, we understand that constrained supply leads to higher prices. How much, when we think about food shortages, is just that actual shortage not having enough to feed people? And how much of it is that what is available is more expensive and therefore affordability becomes a problem and access is an issue?
Right now, at this very moment, we do not have a food availability issue in the world. We are grappling with a food accessibility and a price-related issue. But hopefully, as we continue to see more movement and perhaps getting grain moved out of the Black Sea region, we are seeing record prices start to ease a bit. We are having good good crop production forecasts in a number of the important regions of the world. And so the very, I think, important message for all of us is to really make sure that we keep markets open, that we don't find ourselves in a position where countries are imposing unnecessary trade restrictions or other kinds of bans on market openings. This will be another really important, I think, aspect of navigating these next several months.
Beth Bechtel, Deputy Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, thank you so much. Welcome back to Bloomberg Green. I'm Kaylee Lines from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. Greening agriculture remains one of the biggest challenges in the fight against climate change, with food systems responsible for as much as 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, as well as contributing to a loss of biodiversity. At the same time, extreme weather events linked to rising temperatures undermine farming and seafood production, creating a vicious cycle. One solution may be swapping breadth for height and farming into the sky. Vertical farming methods may be able to deliver high-quality produce to local consumers with less waste and without concerns over fickle weather.
With chefs like me, I want to not only know, but I want to be part of the action. What is very important about indoor farming is that this opportunity to really understand the possibilities that we have in the years to come to keep feeding the world.
So at Bowery, we build smart warehouse-scale indoor farms. We stack our crops from the floor to the ceiling, under lights that mimic the spectrum of the sun, so we can grow 365 days of the year, completely independent of weather and seasonality. What we're really doing is not just reinventing farming, we're actually reinventing the entire supply chain. We are locating our farms close to the cities that we are actually serving. This means that we can deliver our product a day or so after harvest versus weeks or months of time in the traditional agricultural system. Jose Andres has been an investor and an advisor and a friend of Bowery for quite some time.
Works in our kitchen, we are able to respond in multiple events at once, some because of the pandemic, some because of political situation.
And this is the situation inside Ukraine right now.
The cooks like me that we feed the world, we are finding many of the solutions to solve many of the problems that we face in the simple thing of producing food.
We grow completely pesticide-free produce, so there's no herbicides, no fungicides, no insecticides. We're over 100 times more productive than a square foot of traditional farmland, and we use only a tiny fraction of water compared to traditional agriculture. What makes that all possible is a combination of robotics and automation that we design and develop on our own, as well as the Bowery operating system. It allows us to control at a very micro level all of the conditions and the attributes around our crops and to adjust variables in real time. And that kind of control allows you to drive flavors and attributes of crops that we've never even experienced yet before. At Bowery, we've focused on leafy greens and herbs as a start. And we have the technology, we have the retail partnerships, we have the know-how to begin to move into new crops. The strawberry is this incredible representation of what we can do at Bowery. It's a fruit that's extraordinarily seasonal, one of the most pesticide-ridden fruits. These aren't issues that we face at Bowery, and so we can focus on variety and flavor and texture.
This strawberry is quite awesome. The smell is unbelievable. It's a great strawberry. If the strawberries are as good as the ones I taste today, of course, be in my restaurants, totally. Bringing the right technology, the smart technology, to be able to produce faster, quicker, better, smarter, less use of water. Now doing strawberries, that tells me that the next crops will be even more calorie-dense crops.
At Bowery, we've been growing hundreds and hundreds of variety of crops. We're thinking about agriculture for the generations to come, given the climate crisis that we're dealing with today.
More mechanisms to produce food in a sustainable way, more chances we have to solve many of the food issues we face.
Not all of us have the luxury to go to a farmer's market. We can bring that high-quality, local, fresh produce to consumers everywhere in all types of retailers as well.
So what you see here is very much the future in more ways than one.
For more, let's bring in Erez Galonska, the CEO of one of Europe's largest vertical farming facilities, Infarm. Great to speak with you, Erez. So let's just talk about vertical farming as a whole and what problem it is you're trying to solve. First
of all, we are at Infarm building a global farming network powered by AI to provide premium produce, if you like, in affordable prices. Our vision is to help cities become more self-sufficient in their food production. And I can tell you that at Infarm, we ask ourselves one of the biggest questions and trying to overcome one of the biggest challenges humanity faces, how to feed close to 10 billion people by 2050. We know that we have three main threats, very big ones, that the world is facing today: climate change, pandemics, and of course wars. And these shocks represent major wake-up call to the fragility of our food systems and the need to make them more resilient and more reliable to feed people at scale. And this is exactly what we are doing at Infarm.
So obviously there is a major challenge that you are trying to help address, but that doesn't mean that you don't face challenges yourself. What do you think the biggest issue is facing vertical farming as it attempts to scale and meet the world's needs?
First of all, I will echo again, the biggest ones is execution. And with the climate change and the pandemics, supply chain disruption, logistic costs going up, inflation, and other very big problems that occur today. We know that these shocks install time, and we are very much focusing on execution, delivery of products to our consumers and to our clients. I can tell you that we already signed hundreds of millions of contracts with leading retailers globally. So it's about execution and delivery on time, and it's extremely challenging during these turbulent times.
Well, clearly Infarm is growing very quickly. What scale do you think you'll be able to reach eventually?
By 2030, we intend to have growing centers in 20 countries with millions of growing square meter active in the field, growing the entire fruit and vegetable basket. I can say, despite the supply chain disruption and the ongoing war in Ukraine, we continue to execute. We just launched new facilities in 2022, increasing our footprint by 20,000 square meter, which is 40% up than F1 of last year.
And just widening the lens beyond Infarm, when we think about vertical farming as a whole, what role do you see it playing eventually in the agricultural mix? Is this going to supplant traditional agriculture one day in the future?
In order to mitigate risk and overcome those mega challenges, we need to diversify and we need to find alternative ways to farming. And of course, vertical farming, controlled environment agriculture, it's one of those solutions. If you look on the total addressable market, the fruit and vegetable market, we are talking about 3 trillion, soon to become 6 trillion fruit and vegetable market. And the vertical farming market share from this is going to be in around 30 billion by 2030. And I can say that this trend will continue as food and food security become even more important in times of crisis.
All right, on that note, we will leave it. Erez Galonska, the CEO of Infarm, thank you so much. Okay, so we've looked at how we might farm better on land, but how about our oceans? Sustainable fish farmers say rearing salmon far away from their wild cousins solves the problem of waste, parasites, and disease. So let's take a look at how Sustainable Blue farms in a closed-loop ecosystem to minimize their environmental impact.
Any salmon that's produced on land is better than a salmon that's produced in an open net pen. The attitudes are changing. Per capita consumption is increasing of seafood, and aquaculture needs to respond. My name is Kirk Havercroft, and I'm CEO for Sustainable Blue, which is a land-based salmon farm situated on the Bay of Fundy. Currently, in North America, we consume somewhere in the region of 500,000 metric tons of Atlantic salmon every year. But only about 140,000 metric tons of that is actually produced in North America. And the reason for that is that salmon farming in the ocean can only take place at certain latitudes because salmon need a fixed range in water temperature within which they can survive. There's what we call open forms of aquaculture, and this is where we see cages or pens that are suspended in the open ocean. So if there are any diseases or anything like that, there's no way of protecting your fish from that. And that's a critical piece of the problem that we're trying to solve. So RAS farming has a tremendous opportunity to fill that domestic production gap. The acronym RAS stands for Recirculating Aquaculture System. The water circulates between the fish tank and the filtration system, which keeps that water clean and returns it back to the fish. And that keeps the fish healthy and protect the fish from whatever those threats might be out in the ocean. In traditional RAS farms, as the fish are feeding and producing that waste, the waste is filtered out and then finally discharged back to the ocean. And that was a particular component that we wanted to resolve. Sustainable Blue has developed its own filtration system, which does not discharge any waste back to the ocean at all. The advantage that that gives us is we can detach fully from being located by the ocean and produce fish where the fish are consumed rather than producing fish where the farm has to be located. We actually have both freshwater facilities and saltwater facilities here. We have to do that because such that their biology needs freshwater at the start and saltwater at the end. So we're not about to change that. We have to replicate what happens in the wild. Whilst I think what we all felt was a small business when we started, over the past 10 years, what we've seen is the almost infinite potential that this kind of technology brings. It has given Sustainable Blue the position of being, to the best of our knowledge at least, the only zero-discharge saltwater aquaculture facility anywhere else in the world.
From the problems of food scarcity, supply chains, and environmental concerns to solutions like vertical farming, this week we've explored the impact of agriculture on society and the environment. That'll wrap it up for this edition of Bloomberg Green, but you can keep the conversation going by following us on YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter @Climate. From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green.